Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff, coming to you from Ra'anana in Israel. It is July 21st, 2024. And yes, I was being sarcastic before when I said slow news day. It struck me earlier as I was putting together the last minute touches on my outline for tonight that any one of these smaller events in Israel would be major news in any other country in the world. I'm not even talking about what's happening with the Houthis or our conflict with Hezbollah in the north. Even having our ministers being sanctioned or being threatened to be sanctioned by the US government, that would be major news anywhere else in the world. In Israel, it's on the fifth or sixth page. It's just pushed to the back because of everything else going on and everything else that's so pertinent. And if you're joining us for the first time on Inside Israel, this is not the podcast where I'm going to explain Iran's connection to the Houthis in Yemen and the geopolitics of the region. This is the one where I'm going to explain what Israelis are talking about, how we're reacting, what we're thinking about Biden dropping out of the race, about the fact that we now have another front on this war opening up. Ad matai, as we say in Hebrew, until when? And that's all going to come in the second part of the podcast. As you know, I always begin with a little bit of personal narrative, a little personal commentary on something going on in my world, with the idea being that by doing that, I actually expose you to the larger world of Israel and the reality and challenge of life here right now. Tonight's episode is called 11 Funerals. And yes, we will get to all the big news stories. But first, I'm going to tell you about my conversation with someone who's become a very close friend of mine, despite the fact that he is, let me do the math, a whopping 26 years younger than I am. But like so many young Israelis, he's mature beyond his years. His name is Omer. Omer used to be the number one tennis player in Israel. Some of you may know I'm a huge tennis, I can't even say fan. I mean, it's after my family and my work and you, my audience, and the people who work with me. Tennis is my secret obsession. I guess not so secret. I've written four books. Three of those books are related to Jewish life in Israel, but my fourth book is related to tennis. I found a way to turn that passion into a book as well. And I'm always taking lessons and trying to learn from the best tennis players around me. And for a while, Omer was my coach. He was, as I said, the number one junior in Israel. But then when it came time for him to do the army, he came to a crossroads. Some of the top athletes in Israel, and very, very few, are given what's called a ptor tzva'i, an army release, so that they can pursue their athletic dreams and contribute to the country in a different way through their athleticism. And Omer was on the fence as to whether or not, when he reached 18, he would try to pursue this athletic release, this ptor tzva'i, or go to the army. And indeed, he chose to go to the IDF instead. I think, like a lot of top athletes in Israel, they realize that they're very good, but in relation to athletes from around the world and in compared to the world stage, they're not good enough to make it their full career and to have an income and a life and a salary based on their sport. And so Omer chose to go to the army, and he did what's called the gibush, sort of the tryouts for the elite units, and he got one of the most elite units in Israel. And I don't want to share too many details. I'm not going to tell you his last name. I'm not going to tell you what unit he was in, just to protect him a little bit because he was, I spoke with him beforehand, and he was adamant that I only share certain details, enough to keep it general and vague, and yet at the same time specific enough to give you the insights I wanted to share. But suffice to say, he's in one of the most elite combat units in the IDF and did his 3 years mandatory service. And then, of course, he was called up for Gaza. And when I went out with him the other night it was supposed to be coffee, but it turned into a whole sushi dinner in the mall in Ramat Aviv, the northern part of Tel Aviv. We had a long conversation about what he went through in Gaza. And I want to share four aspects of that story with you tonight. I think by sharing Omer's story, you will actually get a very up close glimpse of so many people's stories. Soldiers, of course, but also other Israelis who were and are still affected by October 7th, as we all are. So, number one, Omer's platoon was the second platoon to enter Gaza as part of the ground operation. On October 7th, Israel did not immediately go into Gaza, and it didn't go in on the 8th or for that entire first week or two. I forget how many days it was. Something tells me it was about 21, 22, 23 days before the ground operation began. During those first 3 weeks, and I was podcasting then during that time, and I remember telling everyone, it's going to come. We're going to go in on foot, but not yet. And I explained then, what I'll explain right now is that those first few weeks, the Air Force was simply flattening northern Gaza so that ground forces could go in and not be hit by sniper fire. This is the result of a lesson we unfortunately had to learn after Tzuk Eitan in the mid 2000s when we went into Gaza probably too quickly. And I think we lost between 60 and 70 troops in a very short period of time. And it was because buildings were still intact and we were able to be fired upon from Hamas in these buildings. So during those first few weeks, the Air Force really cleared out northern Gaza. And then Omer's platoon was the second one on the ground in Gaza. And their intelligence told them that the northern part of Gaza had been cleared out. And so they shouldn't expect any kind of conflict or combat once they went in. Well, lo and behold, within minutes of entering northern Gaza, they began to be fired upon. He doesn't know if it's just that the intelligence was wrong or that intelligence missed something or that maybe intelligence wasn't aware of the extent of the tunnels. I don't think at that point we knew that the tunnels were literally hundreds of kilometers long, longer than the entire tube system, the subway system in London. So it could be that they were fired at from Hamas operatives coming out of these tunnels. But for a few hours, Omer and his platoon found themselves pinned to the ground behind a short sand dune, but really otherwise not protected until finally they were able to call in some air support and Air Force helicopters and planes were able to clear the source of the fire and allow them to continue into Gaza. So that was the first aspect of the story that I wanted to share with you is that not only was he the first, one of the first in, but the intelligence was wrong from the beginning in terms of what their platoon would face. And the second aspect I want to share with you is just what daily life was like for him and those in his platoon in Gaza. I was really, really curious. Where do you sleep? Where do you go to the bathroom? What do you eat? Um, are you scared? We'll start with that last one. He said that yes, there were definitely times when he was scared, and yet he'd had enough training to be able to function. All of his platoon mates had enough training to function through the fear. But also, he said something which I think is, I talked about his maturity before, and I think this is wise beyond his years and also extremely Israeli and not something you would typically find in American, 23 and 24-year-olds. He said, we all knew that our lives didn't matter as much as those of the hostages, that our role was to rescue and free the hostages and to keep the residents of Israel safe, particularly those in the south. And so fearing for our own lives, it didn't enter into the equation. It wasn't part of their lexicon. He told me that. Um, I found that extremely worldly and mature. In terms of the logistics, where they slept, where they ate, by the end of that first day, they were able to enter a built-up area, a town. Now that town had been completely evacuated at that point. The IDF pulled off really one of the major not just operations, but I would say major accomplishments in military warfare. Being able to clear out about 1 million residents out of northern and central Gaza in a very short period of time for humanitarian reasons, so that they would not be killed in the operations that would follow in the crossfire. And so they were in this town inside a refugee camp. And he made a point that, yeah, you hear refugee camp and you assume it's going to be slums and like tarp pulled over poles and aluminum siding just crinkled up and you're huddling under that. He said that's not what it's like. He said inside these refugee camps, there are apartment buildings, sometimes some very nice apartment buildings. So he made a point to explain that that's what the refugee camp was. So they were staying where they sleep, they slept in abandoned apartments inside these buildings, apartment buildings in the refugee camp. And I said, but literally, where did you sleep? Are you in their beds? He said, no. In the situations that he and his platoon were in, there were all these mattresses stacked in all the apartments. I think what he said is that the tradition of Arab hospitality and welcoming the family in and traveling around to see family, it led to the phenomenon that every apartment had a stack of mattresses available for guests to when they would come over, and they'd just pull out a mattress and sleep there. And that's where they slept. They would just throw these mattresses on the ground and sleep, uniforms on, boots on. Someone, of course, at least one or two would keep the guard, do shmirah to stay awake through the night. There was always at least one person staying awake. Did not sleep very well. Often, I mean, pretty much a constant state of being overtired, not getting good night sleeps. Also, just the nervousness. And I remember this from being in Lebanon. When I was in Lebanon as a combat soldier, we were allowed time to sleep, but it wasn't a good sleep. You always had one ear open, one eye kind of open. Um, it I liken it to it now when I'm flying from Israel overseas to the US. Usually my flight is at 5 a.m. and that night before there's no sleep either because you're sort of waiting for that alarm to go off. In the same way, when you're in the combat zone, you're waiting for what could come next. But in any case, they were sleeping in these apartments on mattresses. Going to the bathroom, I said, "Do you have bathrooms in these apartments?" He said, "Yes, there were bathrooms, but there was no plumbing at that time. There was no water system. And so they would go in plastic bags and then seal the bags up to prevent it from the smell from overtaking the apartment. But that's what they were doing for months at a time. And the soldiers who are there now we can assume they're doing the same thing. Food, they would get resupplied either daily or every few days. It was manot krav. This is everyone who's in the army in Israel knows what this is. It means combat rations. I think in the U.S. military, it's called ready to eats. A can of tuna, a can of corn, maybe some sliced bread. You share it. You get a box for 3 or 4 of you. Share it, pass it around. That is what your meal is. Back when I was in the army, we had loof, which is kind of like Spam. I don't know if they've replaced that. I kind of assume they would. What I remember most from the combat rations when I was in the IDF was that this was 1997, 1998, and they were stamped kosher for Passover 1981, 1982. So these had been sitting around for 16 years in the can, and they're made to be kosher for Passover, so they don't have to manufacture a different type come Passover time. Um, but that's what combat rations are. He also mentioned that in Gaza, it was a mix of chaos and action, but also a lot of downtime. And I've talked to other soldiers who served in Gaza as well, and they've mentioned the boredom. They've mentioned how much sitting around there is. And then all of a sudden, there's a ton of action. Uh, but a lot of it is just sitting around keeping your eyes open. And that's also how sometimes soldiers are caught off guard, that they are lulled into the dreariness of day in, day out, not doing much. And that is when the enemy, if the enemy attacks, can catch us off guard. That would happen in Lebanon, unfortunately, all the time when I was there. That does lead me to the next takeaway from my conversation with him. And that would be excuse me, that would be the first piece of real action they saw. Um, I've mentioned this before on the podcast, how ubiquitous the booby trapping is in Lebanon, that buildings would be booby trapped, that tunnels would be booby trapped, so that if soldiers went into tunnels, they would explode. So they had to be careful all the time. And at one point, and I don't remember if it was a mosque or an apartment building, but they discovered a very large entrance to what would be a very large tunnel. Um, and so it was so big that they called the major officer who was with them. It's called the Mempe, in English, the company commander, went himself to check it out. And lo and behold, he took a team of soldiers with him, and it was booby trapped. And when it went off, a number of soldiers were killed and a number were injured. And this was a big point that he made. The extent of the injuries, and we had a significant part of our conversation talked about how Israel is reacting to the fallen, the dead soldiers versus the injured. Um, it is all major news here in Israel when a soldier dies. When soldiers fall, it is front page news. We see their pictures on the front page of the printed newspaper, but in our digital feeds, the picture is prominent. There's a biography of the soldier. We know where he grew up, where he went to school. He's eulogized. And there have been around, wow, I don't know the exact number. I think just over 300 soldiers who've been killed at this point in Gaza, just in Gaza alone. That's not including on October 7th in southern Israel. In terms of the injured, however, Omer and I agreed, we do not pay nearly enough attention to that. We see the word injured and we just sort of read over the word. But he was telling me what injured means, and he saw it firsthand because he was evacuating his platoon's job was to evacuate those who'd been injured and killed from this booby-trapped explosion of the tunnel. And he said in Hebrew it was basar, meaning meat. It was just he was pulling out soldiers with no legs, no arms. They would, if they could find the arms and legs, they would pull those out as well separately. And we agreed that these are soldiers who their lives are changed for the rest of their lives. This is not something that they will recover from or recuperate from in the sense of being whole again. They might learn to live without their legs or without their arm or blind or being deaf, but this is it for the rest of their life. This is their reality. This is their situation. And I don't think we Israelis here are paying enough attention to that. As far as I know, I've given the stat before on the podcast. I think it's 2,000 soldiers so far have been designated permanently injured as a result of the war in Gaza. It might be even higher. My wife Dorit was at a Shiva call a couple of weeks ago, and at that Shiva call was another soldier and his wife who had been in the same platoon as the soldier who'd fallen. And this other soldier was injured in this same incident, and he was blind and deaf now. Um, and his wife was with him and was talking to Dorit about she didn't know how they would go on, what would be next. I mean, she married this young man, and now this young man she's married to, a young couple, is blind and deaf for the rest of his life. So Dorit was talking with her about uh, raising money for maybe Apple Watches, because apparently Apple Watches have a certain feature that's ideal for people who are blind and or deaf in terms of signaling and impulses and how they vibrate. I don't know enough about it, but it was a conversation that Dorit found herself in with this woman. The larger point being that the injured are often forgotten or overlooked. And Omer and I agreed that in many cases it might even be preferable to be killed than to be injured with this kind of life-altering permanent injury. He showed me the picture of one friend of his from the platoon, who's lost his legs, and now he was in a wheelchair. In the picture he showed me on his phone, he's in a wheelchair with no legs. And Omer told me that this young man is going to start taking up tennis. And Omer is going to maybe work with him a little bit to teach him. He's not a tennis player. He wasn't a tennis player before, but sort of looking at for what his life is going to be like. And wheelchair tennis might be one of the avenues he takes. And so Omer might work with him a bit. But the injured, we need to pay attention to them too. I asked Omer about his own psychological condition as someone who had to remove people and see this up front and evacuate them. And he said, yeah, he went to a psychologist a couple of times that the army provided, but it didn't seem like anything deep. It didn't seem like anything. It didn't sound like Omer was considering lifelong therapy or something intense. It sounds more like a box was checked that he saw the psychologist, talked it out a few times. Um, but it does make me think that I'm gonna, this is definitely something I'm gonna try to stay on top of. I know PTSD is a big issue in Israel right now. We talked about this on last week's pod, and sadly, we're probably going to continue to do so. But this is a major issue for the country, is where it goes forward with all the PTSD. By the way, not just among soldiers, but among residents as well. And the question also related to PTSD is that it's not just what is done to you and what is done to your friends, but also what you have to do to the enemy. That killing can cause PTSD, especially killing people up close. I must say that from the soldiers I've talked to, the PTSD that they are talking about, their anxiety has absolutely nothing to do with killing the enemy up close or bombing the enemy or taking the life of the enemy, including women and children. It mostly seems related to what they have seen done to their comrades, what they have experienced themselves. I'm not speaking for everyone, um, but what they're seeing up close to their fellow soldiers far, far outweighs, I think, any emotional effects they're feeling as a result of what's happening to the enemy. So those are the first three aspects of the story that I wanted to share. The fourth aspect has to do with October 7th itself. There's been a big question. It's still on our minds and probably on a lot of your minds. Why on October 7th were the residents of Kibbutz Be'eri and other Moshavim, kibbutzim in the south, why were they waiting from 6:30 in the morning until 2:30 in the afternoon or longer? Why were they waiting 8 hours for the Israeli army to show up? We're slowly learning why and what happened, but Omer was able to give me some firsthand information. On October 7th, as soon as it happened, he got a phone call that morning telling him to report to his base. His base is in the center of the country, and they were ready to go and motivated. And they didn't know the number one is no one really knew the extent of what was happening. I remember when I first heard what was going on, the news was out that maybe three terrorists had actually snuck into Israel. And then the news came out it might be as many as 10 or even a dozen or maybe 20. We now know that it was in the thousands, probably 3,000. Uh, when the news first broke, we'd heard that a soldier had been kidnapped, possibly civilians, one or two civilians. We now know that it was well over 200, close to 300 civilians and soldiers kidnapped into Gaza, with 120 or so still there now. So part of it was simply not understanding the gravity of the situation, but really the new twist that I'd never heard before was Omer started telling me about what happened when they got their equipment. He said it took a really long time for them to be issued their equipment for the battle that they were going to go face on these kibbutzim in the south against Hamas. And he said, in retrospect, we realize now what the mistake was. The mistake was the army started issuing us the standard equipment you would issue to a soldier as if he were going off to fight a war in Syria or a long war in Iraq or maybe Lebanon for an extended period of time. Huge, backpacks with all the equipment you would need, rain gear, different jackets. He said what we should have done in retrospect was get a vest, a rifle, a supply of bullets, a helmet, and go. We didn't need that big backpack. We didn't need all that other gear that they were issuing to us. This was not a war to be fought over months at a time on land in some foreign country. This was in our own territory, in kibbutzim, in conflicts and combat that would probably take a few hours. And we weren't given the equipment appropriate for that. It would have been much quicker had they just given us that basic equipment that we needed. Um, I found that really eye-opening. And I asked him why this was, and he gave me an answer that unfortunately we're hearing a lot in Israel lately, which is meruba, which means square, inside the box, that the army is so trapped inside its box of thinking that it's simply unable to break out of that box and think differently when it needs to. Now, on the one hand, this is really odd because Israelis are improvisers, if nothing else. For the most part, Israelis do not tend to be good with following directions, staying on the normal path. What Israelis are really good at is kind of being MacGyver and using whatever tools they have to make the best out of it. In a recent survey, Israeli children ranked kind of low when it came to math skills and science skills compared to other children around the world, but they were maybe number one or very high in terms of out of the box thinking. So Israelis learn how to improvise and think out of the box. So why not the army? What Omer and I kind of talked about is that the army is such a big ma'arechet, such a big system, such a big organization that there just isn't this room for improvised thinking, that when something like October 7th comes up, the default is to go to what they've always done before, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense in the moment. And in this case, that meant issuing the same equipment that they always would be issued in a situation like this. And we see this playing out in other areas. One of the biggest was the intelligence leading up to October 7th. We were apparently so convinced that Hamas couldn't pull off what we'd been reading about in the intelligence. This Operation Jericho Walls, we intercepted that white paper explaining exactly what they were going to do on October 7th. We were so caught up in our own assessment of what we assumed the situation was that we couldn't even entertain the idea that maybe this was for real. In fact, it just came out in Israel today that Sinwar was in touch with Israeli officials, warning them of uprisings in jails, not really warning, but sort of goading them, saying that there's going to be a great uprising coming soon, and Israel will never be the same after this big action that's going to take place. Sinwar, the architect of October 7th, who's now hiding underground in Gaza, was communicating somehow with Israel. We don't know with who or what. The news story is very short, so we don't know details. But again, we were so caught up in our own thinking that we couldn't even entertain the idea that it might be different. And one of the lessons I hope we're going to learn is that even the impossible could be possible. We cannot underestimate our enemies anymore. So those were the four aspects of the story of Omer's and my conversation the other night that I wanted to share with you. In a few minutes, we're going to come back for the news section of the pod. I'm going to shut the camera for a couple seconds. See you in a few. Welcome back to Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff. We're now moving on to the news section of the podcast. It's hard to say what the number one news story would be this week. It's obviously has changed maybe in the last 2 hours. I'm going to stick with what my original number one story was, and that is Netanyahu's departure to the U.S. and a possible hostage deal. There were big rallies in Israel last night, as there always are on Saturday nights, but this time it was with a real imperative. The slogan in Hebrew was Ein Nesiyah ad sheyesh iska, meaning there's no flight, there's no trip until there's a deal. Israelis were saying, we don't want you going to Washington, Netanyahu, until you've signed a hostage deal. Nevertheless, this hostage deal has not been signed yet. 72% of Israelis do want this hostage deal to be signed. So clearly the public is in favor of it. The army, the Secret Service, the Shin Bet, the Shabak have all said that the security situation is safe enough now that a hostage deal could be acceptable, even one that includes Israel leaving Gaza entirely. And yet Netanyahu still refuses to sign any deal. There is talk that there will be a deal. I heard one commentator on the news today saying that within 2 weeks there probably will be a deal signed, releasing all the hostages. But for the moment, one of the big stories in Israel is that Netanyahu is departing for Washington with no hostage deal intact. And a lot of Israelis are very disappointed and upset and embittered about that. Making it perhaps even worse is that the Knesset, the parliament, is planning to go on vacation on July 29th until the high holidays. Think about that. From July 29th until the end of Sukkot, while there are hostages in Gaza and soldiers in Gaza and a war in the north, the Knesset is planning to take its regular summer vacation of about 2.5, 3 months. And a lot in the public are upset about that as well. The Knesset has said that the committees, the Defense Committee, the War Committee, those will continue to meet, but it still seems like absolute, if you pardon the French, bullshit to a lot of us Israelis that our leaders would take a vacation while we have civilians doing the opposite of a vacation in Gaza, being held as prisoners in hellish conditions by Hamas still. So that's the number one, I think, news story that people are talking about. Will there be a hostage deal before Netanyahu leaves? And so far, the answer is no. Story number two, not surprisingly, the Houthi attack. The Houthis sent a drone. It flew several hundred miles before arriving. Apparently, the Israeli army was tracking the drone, but it was also tracking another Iranian missile that was in the air. What I heard is that they mistakenly thought that the drone from Yemen was a recreational drone, just some Israeli playing with his drone, and somehow mistakenly miscategorized it. In any case, it was human error that it was allowed to enter Tel Aviv airspace, crash into an apartment building, and killing one Israeli civilian. In response, Israel attacked the port in Yemen, and not just randomly. This is the port where the Houthis have been receiving shipments from Iran. It's where they store fuel, and you can go online and see the enormous fire as a result of this. But it was real damage to infrastructure that would be that the Houthis were using to help carry out their attacks on Israel and Western ships. So this was a carefully planned attack. Complicated. The planes had to refuel in the air on the way there and on the way back. And it looks like it was a success. However, we in Israel have been told to brace for retaliation from the Houthis, possibly from Iran. And so for us Israelis, what we're saying is, Bemet, like really another front to this war? Like it's not enough that Gaza 9.5 months later is still going on. And Hezbollah is attacking the north every single day. Now we have the Houthis to worry about. What's happened to our army? What's happened to our government? What's happened to our deterrence? Who is looking out for us? How can we feel safe? That is what Israelis are talking about. Just this sense of disbelief that it keeps going on and escalating. Where is the iron fist? Where is America to back us up? I mean, this is a world problem, the Houthis, not just an Israeli problem. Why is no one else waking up to this? That's how Israelis are seeing it. And in a way, that's how we're talking about the third news story, which is, of course, Biden dropping out of the race. We're not really talking about the prospects of Kamala Harris, or should it be Josh Shapiro or Gavin Newsom? How should his replacement be chosen? Who's going to be the VP? That is not what Israelis are talking about. Israelis, we're talking about naturally, what does it mean for us? There are some who are saying, well, this means Trump will win, and that's good for us. There are some who are saying this means Trump will win, and that's bad for us. Everyone I've talked to here thinks that this means Trump will win. We don't know. I mean, that's just what Israelis are saying. But one thing I've also heard is some saying that this is good because now Israel is off the front page, that this is clearly between this and the assassination attempt on Trump last week, these are going to be the big stories, and maybe Israel will be a little less scrutinized. There is talk, what does this mean for Netanyahu meeting with Biden? Is it even relevant for him to meet Biden? Will he be able to get a meeting with Trump at the same time that he's in the US? What does this address to Congress look like? I got to remind you also, the news of Biden dropping out broke around 9 p.m. Israel time. So that wasn't, I'm really not out hearing a lot of the conversation just yet. This is just within my inner circle. I think we're still figuring out what to make of it. But for us, the main question is not the horse race nature of politics in America, but what does it mean for us? What does that mean for our ability to get the hostages out, to fight the war with Gaza the way we need to its end, to take on Hezbollah and the Houthis, because we haven't felt like we've gotten the American support we need, not in full lately, not that we expected. Maybe this will change now that Biden is no longer running, that we don't have to worry about, him trying to pander to voters, although we still have whoever the Democratic nominee is, who would need to play to the voters, whatever that means. But we're seeing it from our point of view, as we should. We're worried. This has been a terrible 9.5 months. We want it to get better. And so our question is, will this somehow make things better for us? That's how we're seeing that in all three of these news stories this week. I'm going to shut the camera for a second. In about 5 seconds after that, I will return for the questions portion of tonight's show. And welcome back to Inside Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff. Now, your questions for this week. Some of them we already covered. A number of you wrote in to ask how are Israelis reacting to the Biden announcement, others about the conflict with the Houthis. I'm going to take two questions that are a little bit off those topics. And one of these is related to what was going to be a very big news story. Cindy wrote in, what happens when the Haredi community defies orders when they are drafted in the army? Today, yes, today, Sunday, the IDF sent out 1,000 draft notices to members of the ultra-Orthodox Haredi community to begin drafting them into the IDF. And Cindy's question is very poignant. She didn't ask what happens if the Haredi community defies orders. She said when. And I think that's the right way to phrase it. I think we are expecting that they will defy orders. What I have heard is that they can simply refuse to show up at the induction center a number of times, and they will keep getting letters in the mail. So it's not really what happens when they defy orders once or twice. The real question is what happens when they defy orders 5 or 6 times. Once you get to that point where they've received 5 or 6 draft notices and they still don't show up for their appointments at the draft center, then what happens? Cindy, I don't know. Here are some options. One is that they would be arrested and put in jail. That is what happens to other Israelis who've refused to go to the army when called. It could be that there's some other deal worked out because this is still a political situation that's unfolding. But we are looking at a situation where you're talking about thousands of people defying the orders to be drafted. I don't think we have enough prison space to hold them all. So I'm sorry I can't give you a more specific and exact answer, but we're all kind of holding our breath, waiting to see what happens. Keep in mind that the head rabbis in Israel have been urging their yeshiva students not to join, to refuse these draft orders and to rebel. So you could also see some violence. I've talked about this before, that the ultra-Orthodox Haredi community has been protesting, blocking highways. They've been violent with the police. They will be violent with other Israelis. So Jew-on-Jew violence is something I've talked about a number of times, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see that as well. Rosemary asks, how are Arab and Christian Israelis experiencing these times? Recent polls have shown that Israeli citizens who are Arab, Christian, and Muslim actually feel very tied up with Israel's fate. They say that they feel part of the country, including the country's challenges and problems. That given the opportunity to live somewhere else in the world, 60% of them said they would not. They would live here. That's pretty high. I am curious what is going to happen now that this Houthi conflict seems to be growing, now that the war in the north seems to be escalating. And it's odd. I'm calling it a war in the north. It's not the war we expected, but I think the war has been going on. It's like a low simmer, not quite a boil, but they're attacking us daily. We're attacking them. So I do wonder if that would change. But so far, we are not seeing major issues within Israel. Here and there will be a terrorist threat or a terrorist attack carried out by an Arab Israeli citizen. But on a day-to-day basis, I mean, just where I am, you see the normal mingling of Arabs and Jews. I'm often fond of telling you about how I go to hang out in Park Ra'anana quite a bit, and that's sort of a melting pot of everyone in Israel. We have the town of Tira, which is an Arab town quite nearby. That's where I go for my eyeglasses. When we're there, we'll go to restaurants and grocery shop. We have not been there since October 7th, but we had been and have always been welcomed. So I think one of the strong parts of Israel is the ability of the Jews and the Arab population to get along. So far, within, there aren't major conflicts. I do hope that continues. Last question, Ron. Ron said, I once spent an entire summer in Israel and remember that in August, the country seemed to clear out as Israelis went overseas for vacation. My question, do you get the sense that Israelis are going on vacation this summer? It's a bit complicated, Ron. I do get the sense that Israelis are trying to go on vacation. They want to, although they're doing it reluctantly. There's sort of this feeling of, am I allowed to go on vacation when there are soldiers fighting in Gaza? When there are hostages being held in Gaza? Should I be taking my family to Cyprus or Spain or wherever else we might go? There's also the question of, is it safe to be Israeli right now? My family situation, we all have American passports, we speak English, and so we don't necessarily think we would stand out. But some Israelis don't have that luxury, and they would stand out as Israeli if they travel somewhere. There have been threats against Israelis traveling. Do they want to put themselves in that situation? So maybe better to go to a lot instead. Although, of course, some of the hotels in a lot are full with residents of the north and south who've been relocated. So that's not as simple as it sounds. I think what's agreed is that everyone needs a vacation. It's been, like I said, an extremely difficult 9.5 months for all of us. We've all been working on behalf of the war effort in our own way, whether it's having a family member serving in the reserves or raising money for soldiers or helping out displaced families. It's, as we say in Hebrew, amus. It's growing like a big, it's on our shoulders a lot, the burden of it. And so, yeah, Israelis, I've talked to a lot of Israelis who are going on vacation. My family is looking into planning one. We feel it's okay. Just we need the break. We need the family time. It doesn't mean we're forgetting the challenges and bad circumstances, but we just need to breathe a little bit because it's a very small country and been in a very, very intense 9.5 months. For our final part of the program, our final part of the episode, as I've tried to do lately, is Hebrew is magic. And that's where I introduce a Hebrew word to you and talk about what's unique about it. And the word that I'm going to show you this week, I'm actually going to type it here in the chat, is the word letauped. This is sort of uh, this word has existed for a long time. This is not a new word. However, it's coming back as it feels like a new word. Letarped is an interesting word. It means to sabotage. And the reason we're hearing it lately is the general idea, this fear that Netanyahu and his party have been sabotaging the hostage talks. But then I believe it was last week at the big rally in Tel Aviv calling for new elections, one of the family members of one of the hostages scaled a bridge. I think she rappelled on the bridge or hung from the bridge and spray painted the word "die letarped," like enough with the sabotage. And so now letarped, to sabotage, is much more in the daily lexicon of Israelis. What's interesting about the word letarped is it's derived from English, but a bit incorrectly. As you might be able to tell, it comes from the English word torpedo. So that you can say that in English, like they're torpedoing it. Like to torpedo something means to sabotage it. And yet, when you ask Israelis what it means, they say it means to sabotage, not to torpedo. So it's sort of an interesting case where it was taken from the word torpedo, but now it means to sabotage. It's sort of a chain, how that word developed. But that is your word for the week, letarped, and for better or worse, a bit more popular than it used to be in Israel. Before I close things out, a few announcements from my side. First of all, if you know someone else who would like Inside Israel, who would enjoy it, please go ahead and share the links. You know where you can find the links to the live broadcast. That's on joelchasnoff.com/podcast. And I'll put that here in the chat. That's also, I've sent that only to one person. Let me try that again. That's also where you can see the links to listen to this on Apple and on Spotify. So if you can't make the live broadcast on Sunday night at 5 p.m. Eastern, listen on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Those links are there. If you do listen on Apple and Spotify, my ask to you, give it a rating, ideally 5 stars, although you don't have to. Give it whatever rating you feels fit. But these ratings really help get the podcast out there on these platforms. So a positive rating really, really helps. Another announcement, I'm really trying to grow this podcast, including possibly raising some money to help do some upgrades and take it in some new directions. So here's a little ask to you. I'm looking for a few people who might be willing to hop on a Zoom call, a very short Zoom call, and just talk about ways of doing some financing for the podcast and some creative ways to raise money to support it. both the logistics behind it and also the new projects that I see ahead. So if you have a background in fundraising or business or would want to be a part in any way of this kind of a conversation, best thing to do, you can email me at joel@joelchasnoff.com. Or you can contact me through the website at joelchasnoff.com. There's a contact Joel button, and just send me a note there saying that you would be interested. I'm looking for maybe put together a small committee, would not take a lot of time, but just to get some advice from you on the best ways to help grow this podcast from a financial point of view. Finally, next week's broadcast will be on the 28th of July, Sunday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Best way to get your questions to me, send them ahead of time, either through the weekly newsletter, Hebrew is Magic, or through the email address I gave you above, joel@joelchasnoff.com. Thank you for joining me tonight. This is Joel signing off from Ra'anana, Israel. Quiet times, peaceful times for all of us is what I wish to you. Laila Tov, wherever you are. Thanks for joining. Good night.